Couple things. First, just so you know, I told my morning class that from now on they can leave 5 minutes early, so I got time to clean up and get out of here and get in here. So I should be able to start just about on time. It says 12:04, so I guess I am starting on time. All right. And I got to look tonight because I think I found where I had saved the last time I gave a test, and there was a couple problems with it, so I'm rewriting it. So today we're going to go over chapter 18. I think we talked about that before. Tomorrow we're going to write a bunch of stuff as a class, but again, I'll try to set it up so that no more than like maybe 12 to 2. And then the rest of the period, I'll hand out the test. You can start working on it. You can have some time to work on it tomorrow, and I'll give you some time Tuesday to work on it too. There's only 2 problems, so my hope is if we can get done by 2 tomorrow, and you've got the whole period on Tuesday, that hopefully everybody will finish. All right. As we did yesterday, I just want to, some of this stuff doesn't really apply exactly. Notice there's PHP and the ASP, etc. So I don't want to talk about that stuff. But, you know, Ajax, if you remember, Ajax stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That said, XML is not used that much anymore with this. More than anything else, JSON is used, JavaScript object or notation. And the idea behind Ajax is partial page refresh. All right, you've seen stuff like this. You go out to Google. So I go out here. And I want to start typing in JavaScript. So notice how down below, that's the Google suggest, right? And as I type in more and more stuff, it changes. But the whole screen isn't changing. Just what's inside of that box that's near the bottom of the screen is what's changing. You know, I used to give this example, and it doesn't work very well anymore. Family video, all right? Yeah, I used to have an account there, etc. But it used to be the way they had this set up. Now if I take my mouse and I put it over there, notice what it's doing. It is putting this thing in here, and it's darkening the screen for each one of these. See that? And even with that, it's putting that thing in here, which may just be invisible, and now it's now it's visible, etc. I don't know how it's doing it, but it used to be in family video that if you took your mouse and you put it on one of the new releases, you get a little bubble that would come up that would explain everything that movie was about. Now when you moved out of it, because that was a really good way to show it, I thought, better than this. Better than Google Suggest also. All right. But again, the idea, as it says, it allows you to read data from a web server after the page has loaded, update a web page without reloading the entire page. What used to happen, what still does happen, when the whole page reloads, typically you get what's called flicker, where you get a little flash of white. Even if it goes really fast, you see it. And that's not that that's terrible or anything, but you know, you're making the server do more work than it has to do. All right, and send, as it says, send data to a web server in the background. All right, so with this example right here, it says change content. Pretty obvious what they've done here. All right, so let's take a look at what they have done. The first thing to realize, and we're going to get into this stuff tomorrow as we start to write this, what they show here, totally fine, but it's considered the old school way of doing things. In JavaScript, most of the time, rather than creating a new XML HTTP request, you call the fetch API instead. They both work pretty much the same way and do pretty much the same thing. This works great for what they're doing here, but when you're actually calling out to the internet, fetch works a lot better. All right, and you can use something very similar to fetch once we get into Node, and there's different ones that you can use. The one that we will use is something that's called Axios, which again allows you to go out to the internet, grab some information, and bring it back into your program. So if we look at what's here, let's just look at the script. I don't think there's anything that's in the HTML that surprises anybody. Again, when you click the button, it's saying call load doc. Okay, so here's load doc. So let's look at this. All right. I'm probably butchering the story, but I think it was back like in the 80s or early 90s, there was some student who was doing their work on for their master's thesis or their doctoral thesis, and they realized that basically, believe it or not, Microsoft did something right. Microsoft had created this XML HTTP request object that wasn't really being used for a lot of stuff. So that person figured out how to use it in here to make these callouts to basically help work with Ajax. So as you can see in that line that's in gray right now, we're creating a new variable. All right. And even though they say XML HTTP request, you're going to see it's not exactly that for us, but it's totally fine. All right. And then what we're saying here is, okay, this has got to go through some stages. Try to load this. All right. So if you can load it, basically what are we doing? Well, we're saying document.getElementID demo. So we're getting what's in here. All right. And we want to change the HTML that's on our web page so it is equal to that. So in other words, all right, wherever the heck that is, because it's got to be put in there someplace, all right, we are just telling it to go and change that text. Now, here we're telling it to do the load, then we're telling to open it. If you are calling out to the internet to get some information, that'll be a get. That should make sense. If you want to send information out to the internet, it would be a post. There are also other things that you can send when you start doing this stuff. I don't want to get into that right now. All right. And then you do the send. Now, if I, for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh the page here. All right. And I'm going to comment out this line that says xHTTP.send. And you notice when I hit enter, nothing happens. For lack of better words, this stuff is doing the preparatory work. All right. It's getting it ready. So it's loading the information in. It's basically kind of opening up your connection. All right. And this right here is actually making the request. So that's why I said if you leave this one off. And what this is doing is, this is saying right here, okay, that what we want to do is we want to replace whatever is in here, which is this. That right there is from this, right? Okay. And what it's saying is we want you to go out and there's got to be a file in here called ajaxinfo.txt. We want you to replace the text on the right that you see in gray with the text that's in ajaxinfo.txt. All right? And that's exactly what's happening in here. Now, I don't know if that made a little sense, some sense, no sense, but I mean, that's kind of what's going on. So they explain that in here probably better than I could. So again, the HTML page contains a div and a button. The div is used to display information from the server. All right. The button calls the function if it is clicked. All right. The function requests data from a web server and displays it. So the idea is that file, that ajax_info.txt, is out on a server somewhere. So you are making a request to it. I got a question for all of you. When we did, now for you it's been a while, I know, but for last semester when we did the C# and we talked a little bit about MySQL, do you all still have XAMPP loaded on your computer? Because you might have to check to see if you do. But with a couple of the examples tomorrow, they'll work better because we will simulate using a server, basically. XAMPP will be our server. All right? Okay. So as it says, it's not a programming language. All right? It's a browser built-in object along with JavaScript and the DOM. Now, I don't want to sit and read all this to you, but notice what they're showing in here. All right? So take a quick look. They call this how Ajax works. All right? You're used to this, sending an HTTP request, and you're used to sending a response back. So as they say here, some event occurs on a web page. The object is created by JavaScript. The object sends a request to the web server, which processes the request, sends the response back to the web page. And it's got to send it back typically as HTML so it can be read by the web page. All right. Now, as it says here, modern browsers can use the fetch API, and that's what we're going to use. But because I want that to make sense, we're going to do both. All right. And let's see. I don't know if they're going to show it in here, so I'm just going to go on. I should have looked at this before class, but I didn't. So let's see. That's nice. There we go. Okay. So the Keystone of Ajax is the request object unless you're using fetch. All right. As it says, all modern browsers support this object. Remember that one way we can always go back and check on that is you can go into caniuse.com and you can type in XML HTTP request. Or you can go into caniuse.com and type in fetch. And what you're going to find in both cases is virtually all browsers, with a possible exception of maybe IE before version 11. All right, don't support it. All right, as it says, the object can be used to exchange data with a web server behind the scenes. In other words, you write the code and it's seamless pretty much to you. So it makes it possible to update parts of a web page without reloading the whole page. That's the whole idea behind this. The actual guy, if you ever wanted to read it, just look up Ajax, and I think his name is Jesse James. All right, and you can go and take a look on that. All right. Now, we have started talking about this. We're going to continue talking about this, but we've talked about callbacks before. As it says, a callback function is a function that's passed to another function. Now, the reason that becomes important is, especially when we get into Node.js, is Node.js can only basically, other than some system stuff it does behind the scenes, can only do one thing at a time. All right. The good news is it can do that one thing unbelievably fast. All right. So what happens is, let's say that the one thing that, let's say that it's got 10 requests. You got to do this, whatever it is, 10 different things. And it gets to the third request. And that request is to go out to the internet, find this site, go out to the database on the site, find and run this query. Well, that's not going to be instantaneous. I don't care how fast your machine is. So the idea with a callback is you can basically say, okay, now you've done this, it's going to take a little bit of time. So for lack of better words, you almost put a timer on there. And you say, I'm going to come back in about 5 seconds and see if you've finished. And instead of waiting there for that time, it goes on and does other things. Now, why is that important? That works great, unless the next things that you want to do, if the next things that you want to do depend on that call to the internet and getting that information, you don't want to go on. All right? So what we will get into, like, and I think I even told you this, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing again like I did yesterday until we get in the book, but we go from callback to promise to async await. All right, and you'll start to see the differences between them and the similarities between them. All right, so as it says here, what to do when the response is ready. So once the onload comes back, all right, this is what you want to do. All right. So in this case, what do we want to do? Well, that's the stuff we wanted to do. All right, so they're showing an example right here, and it says, here you can use the data. Well, that may be true, that may not be true. All right, because when it goes through this onload, there's a series of steps that it has to go through. It kind of is waiting. Here, let's see if they can. All right, so there's their states. Okay, so it's got to go through some states. Now, typically this happens like that. It's not that big a thing. But there's more to it than that. I don't know if they probably, of course, won't show it in here. But what happens is after it goes through those states, if it's going to send stuff out to the web, there's other things that can happen. There's going to be a status that's going to come back. Something in the 200 level means it worked. Something in the 400 level means there's a problem on your end. The file wasn't found typically. Things that come back in the 500 stage means there's a problem. It's on the server side. The server might be down or whatever. And as it says, for security reasons, most browsers do not allow access across different domains. As it says there, this means both the web page and the files it tries to load must be on the same server. So, for instance, what it's saying is, let's just say I work for, I don't know, I work for Amazon. It's typically, unless I do something special, if I want to go out, let's say, to Google server and grab something, it's not going to let me do it. All right. So, as it says here, these are the different request objects. This is the key one. It creates the request. Now, you may stick a timer on there that says if my request isn't answered, all right, within X number of milliseconds, then just abort. That's what the abort would be for. All right. When you send that out, you get a lot of information back, such as header information. All right. And you can grab that information if you want to or need to do that. All right. Then, as it says, you open. Notice in there the types are get and post. All right, get if you're grabbing information, post if you're sending information up. Now, I mentioned there's other types. We'll be hitting on that kind of stuff later. It's not exactly in the request, but it'll make more sense at a later time. You have to take my word for it for now. All right. Then there's the send, as it says. That sends the request to the server and set request header. All right. So these are what I mentioned before. And actually, I should have stayed on this page because that's what I wanted to show you. All right. So what happens here? You make a request. By default, it's going to go into here. All right. Because it has to see if it can establish a connection. All right. And then it goes through these steps. I'm not going to run through those with you. I'm not going to read them to you, but you can see them. You don't want to do anything until number 4 has been reached. It is possible something can go wrong in between numbers 1, 0, and 3. So if you're going to make a check in there of the ready state, you want the check to make sure the ready state equal 4. That means, as it says, the request was initialized, the server connection was established, the request was received, and it was processed correctly, and it's finished. All right. Why? Because if you're trying to get information back, you want to wait until that whole process has been completed before you try. All right. So, like, they do a good job right here of explaining everything that's going on. I don't want to read it to you. All right. But this is the stuff. There's a lot more things that can get returned than this. But again, 200 levels are good. 400 levels are typically bad on your end. 500 levels are typically bad on the system's end. And they say right here, if you want, I'm not going to go through any of them, but just to show you, there's a link in there, once it comes up, to the HTTP message reference. Okay? All right, then they start to break it down a little bit. Okay, with the request object, it says you can define a callback function to be executed when the request receives an answer. So what are we doing right here? All right. This is basically saying, okay, on the onload. All right. Once that's been loaded, then attempt to do this. And what's this doing? Well, you already know. It says go out on the web page and find something with an ID of demo. All right. And then take whatever text is in response text. And if that doesn't make sense now, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense when we do some examples of this tomorrow, and put in this.response text. What is this.response text? It's going to be this. All right. So you're telling it to load right here. Once the load has been done, you want to do this. Okay. And this can still be done. You want to open that file and you want to send it, which is going to put it in there. It almost seems ass backwards, but what's going to happen is the onload's going to run, the open's going to run, the send is going to run, and then this is going to run. All right. If you have more than one task, you can create one function for each request. So we could do a bunch of stuff in here, is what they're saying. So notice they've got a couple of these load docs. All right. Now the old way of doing this was on ready state change. Okay? And the reason I say that it's old is here, this, when you work with basically with the open, etc., when you work with that, it's assuming you're already on step 4. Here, you've got to make some checks in here for some of the intermediate states. I don't think this is used much anymore on ready state change. All right. All right. So as it says, to send the request to the server, you use the open and send. I already mentioned they work in conjunction with one another. All right. And as it says there, it is totally legit to put this in here. If you say true, you want this to happen asynchronously. All right, which means do it as soon as you get time, basically. And if you put it as false, it'll do it synchronously. So it'll do it in the actual order it was received. All right, and that's what they're saying in here too. By sending asynchronously, JavaScript does not have to wait for a server response. Instead, it can go on. It assumes everything is going to work. All right. Now, why is that important? Well, that means that really when you try doing this, you typically should put it into a try-catch block. All right, because if it fails, you'll get a catch in there, and you can decide what it is you want to do with it. Okay. All right. Get or post, you know the difference between these. As it says, get is simpler and faster and can be used in most cases. However, always use post when a cached file is not an option. It won't be a thing for us. Sending a large amount of data to a server. Sending user input. Again, we've already talked about that. So you're making a request where you're sending something in. So here's a get. All right. And I don't remember if I think they give a simple post example in here as well. All right. As it says, to make the request synchronous, you change it from true to false. And if you do that, if they even mention this in here, if it's going to be very fast, boom, 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 and you know that stuff's going to work, it probably will work faster this way. All right. Then you get the response back, and notice you get back, typically what you're going to work with is the response text, not the response XML. Now, when you work with the response text, at least at times, it may or may not be in a format you can read. All right. So if it's not in a format you can read, it might be, for example, in JSON format, that if you try to put it on the screen and look at it, this looks like garbage. So you might have to run it through a JSON function in order to get it to work. All right. Again, they talk headers in here for now, at least. I don't want to get into that stuff. So that's what I wanted to cover in here, and I wanted to quickly, and I'm not going to go over all this, but you have to have an idea of JSON, what it is, what it's about, etc. Notice it's a text format for storing and transporting data. The idea is when it was first created, JSON was used in JavaScript, and it still is. But now virtually any programming language can read JSON and work with JSON. All right. So this is what it looks like. And if you take a look in here, that is a JSON object. That's a JSON object that has 3 properties. They're all key value pairs, rather. There's a name property with a value of John, an age property with a value of 30, a car property with a value of null. You also notice that when there's strings, here's one place, don't use single quotes. Always use double quotes when you're working with JSON. All right? And also notice that the number field, do not put in quotes because it's a number field. And for null, you don't have to put one in either. All right? So you can read this yourselves. I already told you what it stood for. All right? It's considered to be a much easier way of working with data than is XML. All right? It says it was originally specified by Douglas Crockford. He's even got books on this stuff. Right? So, as it says, it's syntactically similar to the code for creating objects. So JSON is very similar to JavaScript, to just object-oriented JavaScript. Also, what you're going to see when we get in and start talking about MongoDB, it looks almost, the data that you get in MongoDB looks almost like JSON. It's actually called BSON instead of JSON, where JSON is JavaScript object notation, BSON is binary. I don't know what the S is, but object notation. All right. Big thing about JSON, as it says right there, since it's text only, it can be easily sent between computers and used by virtually any programming language. JavaScript has a built-in function for creating JSON strings into JavaScript objects. Why would you want to do that? Because you can't run JavaScript object methods on JSON strings. So you convert them from a string to an object by using json.parse. When you want to go in the other direction, so if you wanted to go and convert a JavaScript object into JSON, you use what's called Stringify. All right, so Stringify makes it a string, parse takes a string and converts it. All right. So it says you can receive pure text from a server and use it as a JavaScript object. So what happens, in fact, if I can get this darn thing to work that I'm working on the other machine, let's see. All right. This is the Chuck Norris Jokes API. Who cares? Well, if I go out here and I grab that URL that you see right there, notice it's a get because I'm going out to their server and I want to get information. All right? So, Chuck Norris shaves by simply scraping his fingernails across his cheeks. That's, you know, so every time you go out there, so if I refresh the page, it's going to give me another one. All right? But the idea is, this is the first time probably, unless you've done it in another class or by yourself, that you have looked and seen this is the output you get back from an API. All right? Now, different APIs, of course, are going to give you different information. All right? But in this case, what is it giving us? Well, it's giving us the heading information, which is all basically the stuff that's right here. It's letting us know what the URL is, and typically what we want to work with is this. All right. Now, Ms. Shelton here worked last semester, and I think we did this. I think we used, was it the Open Weather? I don't know if it's openweathermap.org, but it's another API. All right. And you can go out and you can, well, that isn't it. So. Might be. Nope.
There's an Open Weather Map API at openweathermap.org.
Yeah,
It's Open Weather Map. Thank you. All right. That, well, okay, this will work. But when you look in here, notice what you can do. So you put in a city. So the idea is you can do this. So I'll put in here Wentzville, Missouri. And I search. Says not found. Make sure you're more precise with the city name, comma, 2-letter country code. Okay, Wentzville, probably US. Plus. All right. But you can see, at least in here, it's got this. All right. We're going to create one of these, if not this week, next week, where we're going to basically be calling a different weather API, and we're going to set it up. We're going to do this and do this in conjunction with Google search, because what we want is something similar to this, but we want to be able to type in anything we want. But as soon as we type in the WENTZ, for example, we should get a Google suggest box that comes down here, and then it says Wentzville. Does that make sense? All right. Plus, we'll set it up so that if it's London, for example, we'll use centigrade, but if it's Wentzville, Missouri, we'll use Fahrenheit. That all make sense? All right. It's not super difficult to do, to be honest with you. It's just a little different because it's probably a different way of looking at it. But the idea when you start running through this stuff is there is information out on this API. And typically when you do this and you want to use that information, all right, what you have to do is you have to apply for an API key, all right, which means you got to sign up for an account for it, all right. It's nothing, there's no money, it's free, etc. The only way that it would cost you money, and we'll talk about this next week too, is you're given this key. You shouldn't share that key with people. So you're going to have a different key, you're going to have a different key, etc. And if you shared that key with people, and they shared it with people, and they shared it with people, and pretty soon 1 million people were using it, and they were all going out to the API all the time, then it's not free anymore, because when you have a certain number of times you go out and use it, it's, for what we're doing, it's like 1,000 times a day, so it's not going to be a thing for you. But if it was in the millions, they don't want to do that for free. There's a server doing that, and they're putting that out there for free as a service, but yes, they're doing it as a service, but they have an ulterior motive. They're thinking that if your site gets popular enough, the free tier isn't going to be enough for you, that you're going to want to go to a paid tier. All right. As it says, JSON makes it possible to store JavaScript objects as text. And that's the biggest thing, right? The biggest part to it. All right. So everything's in name value pairs. They must be separated by commas. It's even legal here, like if you remember when we were working with CSS and you put a bunch of style rules in for an H1 tag, and I said even on the last one, if you want, you can put a semicolon in here. Well, even on the last one here, you can put a comma in there if you want to. All right, you use curly braces to hold the objects, and if you're going to make an array of those, you put them in brackets so you can have an array of objects, and your objects can have arrays in them. All right. So that's about as simple as it gets right there. As it says, it's double quotes that it requires. All right. So that in JSON is going to look like this. Now in JavaScript, you notice the difference. It doesn't seem like a big difference, but in JSON, both the key and the value must be in double quotes. But in JSON, it's like that. In JavaScript, the key is not put into double quotes. All right. JSON has very few data types. That's them right there. You can read them yourselves. All right. As it says, values can be any of the above plus any other valid expression. So here would be an example of an object. So that's an object with 3 different things in it. Now that's a JavaScript object. How do we know that? Because the keys are not in double quotes. All right. As it says, the same way JavaScript objects can be written as JSON, JavaScript arrays can also be written as JSON. Okay? All right. one thing that's going to change in here, as it says, the file type has got to be .json, all right, as opposed to .js. Now the Mime type, and we've never really talked about Mime type. I can never remember what it stands for, but it's something like Multimedia Internet something extension, and I don't remember what that last M is. It doesn't matter. The point is, what that is basically it's saying what kind of information are you expecting. And when we're using JSON, we're going to set it to application.json. What else can you use? There's an application.text if it's just regular text. There's an application or /text. There's an application /HTML. All right, if you're working with HTML. All right. I don't care about the XML. I'm just going to quickly go to the data types here. Again, we already saw that. So there's a string, there's a number, there's an object. We kind of looked at that already. And that's an array. How do you know that's an array? The brackets that are in there. All right. What's the big difference? There's two of them. One is, not only does it look different, but it's going to be accessed differently. All right, because that'll be employees sub 0, employees sub 1, employees sub 2. Where the other case, when we saw it without that, all right, this would be employee.name, employee.age, and employee.city. All right. Now, just quickly with the parse, the Stringify, just a couple more of these. As it says, a common use of JSON is to exchange data to and from a web server. When I showed you that thing before from here, that's JSON that has been returned from the server. Now, that's, let's face it, the only thing we want in here is this, right? We don't care about the rest of it. And especially if you're presenting information to a user, they don't want to see that stuff. All right? So if I had a button that said click here to get a Chuck Norris joke, I want to click the button and I want that. And I don't want anything else. All right? So as it says, when you receive data from a web server, the data is always in the format of a string. But when you parse that using json.parse, then the data becomes a JavaScript object where you can work with it. All right? So it comes in and it looks like this. You use json.parse, all right, to convert it into something like this. All right, it says make sure the text is in JSON format or you'll get a syntax error. Okay, I'm not running through any of the examples. And again, the opposite of parse is Stringify, as it says. When sending data to a web server, the data has to be in a string. So that's going to convert it by using the json.stringify. When storing data, the data has to be of a certain format, regardless of where you choose to store it. All right, as it says, text is always a legal format. Yeah, a Mime type of text will always work. That should be good on here. Now, I'm not saying that made a lot of sense, that you totally understood that, and I know you won't remember it, or you probably won't remember most of it. That's okay. At least you've been exposed to some of the stuff that's in here as we start up. So, Chapter 18, as it says, it shows how to use Ajax, how to update a page without loading a new page into the browser. All right. It says it also shows you how to work with two services that provide data that you can use for development and testing. So we're going to look at all that. We are going to look, I've loaded into here someplace. This is that example that's in the book. So you put a date in here. So for instance, if I put tomorrow's date in, I don't know if it lets me put dates in the future, but I think it does. And I click view. It says date must be between, okay, that and today. Okay, fine. Let's put in a year ago today. So 2020, 9/2. And you'll notice you get an explanation and you get the picture that comes in. So it's going out to this site that's out here. It's grabbing a picture and some text that's associated with this date. And you'll notice that So this is Jupiter and its moons. If I change the date back to 2021 and I view it, you can see how it changes. All right, so we'll take a look at that amongst other things in the chapter. All right, I didn't even look at the photo viewer application, but please look on the screen here, because what we're moving towards is this. We'll talk about how to do this using the XML HTTP request object. We'll talk about this and how to use it with a fetch API. All right, this is what we're going to do as a class tomorrow. All right, we'll look at this picture of the day, but then look how this changes. This is an actual transition into what we're going to be working on when we get into the node, because the node.js stuff, because it's going to talk about callbacks and callback hell. Then it's going to come in and talk about promises. Then it's going to come in and talk about async await. This is pretty much your first exposure to this stuff, so it's a light exposure, for lack of better words. All right, we end up talking about cores, which is cross-origin requests. Again, that's when you're trying to go across and get information from a server that's different from your own. All right. All right. So they show here, and if you look at the difference, all right, here there's an HTTP request, here there's an Ajax request. The difference is the HTTP response always results in a brand new page. In here, since it's data only, it's sending that data back, and it might say, hey, all you have to do, for example, is maybe you've got something on the bottom of your screen that needs updating and nothing else does. So again, it allows you to do what's typically referred to as update in place or a partial page refresh. All right. So as they mention here, when working with Ajax, JavaScript sends the request, processes the response, and updates the DOM with new data. As a result, the browser doesn't need to reload the entire page. It works faster. It works slicker. All right. Ajax requests are often made up of web services that provide APIs. You're going to start writing your own APIs. All right. What's an API? Basically what it is it allows one piece of software to communicate with another piece of software. I mean, that's keeping it about as simple as we possibly can. All right. Ajax requests, as it says, developers can use these to get data from a website. Yeah. Most popular websites provide APIs that let you use Ajax to get data from their sites. There's an API for Google. There's an API for Facebook. There's an API for Instagram. There's an API, heck, for Chuck Norris. All right. Many popular websites, as it says, use Ajax to improve the way they function. So the two common data formats. On the top there is XML, the extensible markup language, and on the bottom is JSON. So what they're showing you there is the same stuff. All right. But in one case, they're showing it to you. I guess I can make that bigger. Okay. And in one case, they're showing it to you in XML format. With XML, we talked about this in other classes. You make your own tags. This right here is not part of, technically, even though it looks like it, this is an XML header. You can tell how popular XML is because when they first created it, the version was version 1. And right now in 2021, the version that would still be version 1. All right. It's not that it didn't catch on, because a lot of places use it, but it never caught on the way people thought it would catch on. In fact, it was that lack of being able to catch on that really brought HTML5 back more than anything else. So again, team member, notice there's only one. Well, there's two, I should say. Management, there's only one. So that would be like your HTML tag. Team members, you make your own tags here. So notice there's beginning and an ending name, a beginning and an ending title, a beginning and an ending bio, etc. Then you write the same thing in JSON. It doesn't really, when you look at it, I don't know if you agree or not, but okay, the first one's maybe a little messier, but it's not that different. But it's over time, it's the way the tools handle these and the tools available. It's much easier to work with with JSON than it is to work with XML. I've worked with XML already. I don't like it. All right. They're even starting to show it here. Most server-side languages provide methods for encoding data into JSON. Now you may remember this or you may not from last semester, but we actually did look at an XML example, a couple of them in the C# class. All right, we looked at an XML file, we went in, we were working with databases, and we changed some stuff, and you saw once we did that, you could see how the XML was updated. All right, again, JavaScript works hand in hand. I mean, it should, because JSON was designed originally to work with JavaScript. That's the JS in there, all right, in JSON. Now, it says it's less verbose than XML, it uses less memory, and most people just find it easier to work with. All right. Now, let's look at this. Let me back up here for a second. All right. Says Ajax requests typically get data from a web service. It says that's why figure 18.3 begins by presenting some information about a web service named JSON placeholder. There are a few of these. All right, there's another one named faker.js, which you may or may not have heard of. But basically what they are is they are APIs that provide all sorts of information that somebody has created. So for instance, if I needed to do some testing, I could go out and get 100 dummy first names, middle names, last names, addresses, etc. I could go get it from a site like this. All right, so the table, as it says, describes the type of data you can request. It's different depending on the thing you use. To make a GET request, as it says, you use a URL. So right here, this would say, I want you to go out to JSON placeholder and get me the first record that's in there. Does that make sense? Or the first user that's in there, whatever you want to call it. Where is that? There it is. So let's see. I'm sure this probably isn't going to work the way I think it is, but we're going to try it anyway. And that is all right. So that's information about somebody they made up. All right. Why is that important? First of all, this is what I want you to start realizing. It's JSON. We know it's got the double quotes around both of these. But if you needed to go out and get information, or maybe I'm filling up a database, for example, you can use a file like this to grab that information. And a couple of other things. Notice in here, so this is an object. This whole thing, the object starts here at the first curly brace and it ends with the last curly brace. But you'll also notice when you take a look, all right, it has other objects inside of it. So embedded inside of the user object is an address object. And embedded inside of the address object is a geo object, which shows the latitude and longitude of this particular address. All right. There's phone information, and again, notice website, name of the company, slogan or whatever it is. I don't know what BS means. Well, I know what BS stands for, but I don't think that's the same BS. All right? So you can come in here and you'll notice that now it's Leanne Graham, and you'll notice, for example, if I put in there 2, how it changes. Now it's Erwin Howell. I don't know how many are in here, but let's put in 1,000. There are not that many, so it just returns an empty object, signifying there's no more information like that in there. All right, so again, that's under this JSON placeholder. And there's faker.js, which is a similar type of thing. All right, as it says, it allows you to generate massive amounts of fake data. All right. Now, is that going to be important? We'll see as we go on. I'm going to go till 1, so stop me when we get there and we'll take a break then. All right. Now, notice what's available from this. That slash users by themselves gives you 10 records. You can get blog posts, comments, you can read all that stuff. All right. Now, typically with these sites, you can also go in and add your own records. When you go in and add your own records, or you go in and you add your own users, they're not added to the official thing of users. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. But you can add them to your copy to see if things are working, basically. All right. All right. So I just went over that and that. I don't think we have to talk about it any more than that. All right. So it says this chapter continues by showing two techniques for making a single Ajax request. First, it's going to show an HTTP request. Then it's going to show a fetch. This is a good place to stop. All right, so we're going to take a break right here, even though it's a little early. It's 12:54. Let's come back, please, at 10 after 1.